Her Majesty Claudia Part 2. So, Part 2 of this is dealing with so opportunistic morality. Um, Now, opportunistic morality would factor into the instinct of an emotionally driven person, uh, in particular women, and I guess you would probably see this in children as well, and very emotional men. So, um, but for the sake of this, I'll say this is pertaining to women. So, opportunistic instincts are seen in women in how they date men, and they typically have very interesting criteria that comes as a result of having opulence, having an abundance of choices that makes it easier for them to be stringent with what they're willing to deal with. Now, an opportunistic person and a person who operates morally from an opportunistic standpoint, um, the lower the value a person has, the lower the moral regard that they're willing to show for that person. Now, this isn't just something that exists with just women. You see men who they'll regard a person as having very low value, or they'll see a person as having very low value, but then they'll treat the person with less moral regard as a result. Now, there are videos on YouTube where uh, they will show a woman who is a gold digger, and a lot of times the woman will uh, show lower more they'll show lower moral regard for a person. They'll just lower respect for the person in question in general, until the person shows them through an object, through a material object, that they have some sort of socioeconomic status that's in line with the material object that's being shown. But then the person who was treating the person with lower regard will change and alter their behavior so that they can get something out of the interaction. So it's kind of an opportunistic switch where the person kind of switches to this, oh, suddenly I'm more moral because there's this opportunity that I can, there's an opportunity presenting itself to where I can get something. So these people who do this, they're not moral. Um, at least uh, there's a kind of chink in their morality where their morality is based off of circumstance. It's based off of situation, which to a certain degree, everyone's morality is based off of circumstance, and that's a different story. Um, I think that's slightly more complicated for the scope of this conversation, but uh, what we see a lot of times with men, especially, and a lot of times I go back to the dating world. When a man shows himself as attractive, whether it's coincidentally or he does it consciously to a woman, the woman will show greater regard for him as a person just based off of the value that she perceives that he is demonstrating to her, uh, unbeknownst to her. Uh, so, uh, I've experienced this where women have treated me very, good, and they've treated me like royalty. But then after I do something that demonstrates that I either have lower value or kind of points to the idea of having, to the perception of having that lower value, the, the behavior of the woman changes, and it becomes more contemptuous, and it becomes very malignant. Even there's less regard for me as a person, because the perception of who I am is kind of altering the consistency, the moral consistency of the person. I've had this happen several times, and it happens to a lot of guys, but it also happens to people in general, and it um, can kind of make for it can kind of make you feel down. What I'll say is, with some of the examples for the gold digging, the the women were actually fairly good people, and uh, they wouldn't actually do anything uh, bad initially. They wouldn't laugh at the guy. They wouldn't, brush him off. They actually sat and had a conversation. Maybe they even liked him. A lot of them liked the guy. Uh, those people, they were morally consistent, regardless of whether there was a high socioeconomic status or not. But then also there was, one thing I'll note about women is that um, there's kind of a hack to hypergamy. Whenever you get a connection to a woman emotionally, that can kind of uh, stave off certain elements of hypergamy, where the woman will just have interests just by nature of the emotional connection that you were able to carry out. Um, and that's just something I think people in this community and just in general should look at. Um, Having high socioeconomic status isn't necessarily the end all be all for guys, even though I am a proponent that it's fairly important for the long run. There are other ways to attract a woman, and there are other things that kind of act as a lure or as a hook. Um, so with Her Majesty Claudia Part Two, the main focus is on uh, opportunistic morality and the change in value and how that can alter a person's moral regard for another person. Um, yeah, Her Majesty Claudia.